This is the Comics Alternative, episode 262, a review of The Best American Comics 2017. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
That's right. And on this episode, Paul and I are going to discuss The Best American Comics 2017, this volume being edited by Ben Katchor. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts could be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that go higher than that.
Yeah, some of those great discounts you're going to find via DCBS's awesome monthly bundles. In this month, you can find a DC Young Animal bundle, you can find Vertigo bundles, you can find bundles for kids' comics, all kinds of bundles at alarmingly low discounts, high discounts, low prices, 50% off most of those, and you can find all kinds of specials that are just tremendous comics value for your buck at Discount Comic Book Service.
Yeah, you really can't go wrong with the people at dcbservice.com. Definitely go to that website because you will find a slew of specials. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. After you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Paul and Derek sent you.
Yep, please do.
Okay, Paul, we should say a few words about this episode and also another one that you and I are going to do in the coming days.
Yeah.
Now, in the past, actually since the Comics Alternative began in 2012, what we've done is, for the very last episode of the year, Andy usually and I have been looking at what we consider our favorite comics of the previous year. And then for the penultimate show, the second to the last week of every year, we use that time to discuss what other people think of as really good comics for a particular period of time. We look at the Best American Comics series.
That's right.
That year's volume from Houghton Mifflin and Harcourt. We didn't do that a couple weeks ago, back in 2017.
Yeah.
We didn't get either of those shows recorded. And so what we're going to do now over the next week or so is we're going to publish these episodes. We're doing this actually after the new year. And they're going to go up in addition to our regular weekly review shows. It's kind of a way of catching up. But we really couldn't get to these shows as we had planned because it may sound like a cliche, but as people say, life got in the way.
Life does get in the way. And Derek, thanks for having me on for this. And I just want to give my apologies to listeners who, if they're like me, we're waiting with bated breath for these episodes to come out. It tends to be really good end of the year or holiday fare and those times off, maybe between holidays or things like that. And I was really excited to be invited on, not only to talk about Best American Comics 2017, but also to talk about the best of the year. Sadly, in my family, we had some struggles. My mom passed away the day after Christmas this year, and it was, of course, sad and hard for us as a family, but went as well as it could, all things considered. But it meant that I was unable to come on and record as we had planned and promised, Derek. So thanks for the forbearance of listeners, and hope you all understand and we'll still enjoy this conversation about Best American Comics 2017. Thanks to Houghton Mifflin for sending us review copies, and apologies that this didn't come earlier. As you said, Derek, life gets in the way, but happy that we can be here now and talking about comics. It's a good sign for our lives when we can.
Yeah, that's I think really well put. So now you and I are doing having our discussion of the 2017 volume of Best American Comics, and then in the next week or so, we're going to be coming out with our episode, what we consider, Paul and I consider, the best comics or our favorites of 2017. So look forward to that.
Mm-hmm. Look out for that. That's gonna be a fun chat.
Okay, Paul, every time I do one of these Best American Comics episodes where we look at this volume that Houghton Mifflin Harcourt puts out, and now Bill Kartalopoulos is the series editor and has been for a few years now, I'm always at a loss exactly where to start, and I don't like to go the route of, what is your favorite? What are your favorite pieces in this collection?
I was going to ask you that question actually in that exact tone. I'm just kidding.
The goofy tone.
Yes, right. Goofy.
Yeah, actually, I did make a list. I'll talk about that in a moment, but I did make a list of what I consider some of the standout stories, very subjective,
right?
And more dealing with maybe pleasure than critical appreciation. But again, I'll bring that up in a moment.
Sure.
Perhaps a way of beginning would be to looking at this collection as a whole and seeing if we can ferret out any, tendencies or unique characteristics of this Ben Katchor's volume, and how it may stand out from the previous volumes of the Best American Comics.
Yeah, that's right. Some of the things I've enjoyed about your past conversations with Andy about this volume, as well as your discussions with Mr. Kartalopoulos himself, is that the way that you've teased out how the editor, the respective editor year to year, be it Neil Gaiman or Scott McCloud or whomever, has, put their own imprint on the volume because of their selection process. And I think that this is indeed a very distinctly Ben Katchor volume, and also a very distinctly 2017 volume in light of where we are now in American society, culture, and politics. And so it'll be, I think that's a fun chat to really talk about what's distinctive about this year's collection.
Yeah. For me, and I'm curious what you thought was the standout tone or theme or organization of Katchor's volume. For me, what distinguished the 2017 The Best American Comics volume is its marked difference from the others in terms of creators that I was not aware of. Now, every volume of the Best American Comics, of course, includes quite a number of people that I'd never heard of before, or if I hadn't read their work. But I think that there's a larger percentage of unknowns, for me at least, in this volume. Another thing that stood out, I do recognize a lot of the names, right? Gabrielle Bell, Joe Sacco, Kim Deitch, Bill Griffith. These are some of my favorites. But a lot of them in this volume I did not recognize.
Right.
Another thing that defines this volume to me is that this, I think, is the most experimental volume of the Best American Comics so far. In other words, there are more works in this volume, the 2017 one, that are different, experimental, offbeat, or challenging. Which brings me to yet a third kind of a distinguishing feature of the 2017 Best American Comics. It is the most challenging volume of the series I've ever read. And I mean that in a couple of ways. One, in terms of the way that the the comics are presented, definitely at least a good half of them, the narrative is not, if you can call it a narrative, is not presented in a conventional format.
Right.
But it's also it was also a challenge to me because it was physically a challenge. There are a number of comics in here where the writing was small and very detailed, and I'm sure this is a function of me getting old and my eyes not being what they used to be.
No,
but I swear, I was holding this volume of Best American Comics closer to my face than any previous volume of the Best American Comics.
Sure. Yeah, you definitely smell that Best American Comics volume smell more than previous volumes, because you do have to peek in, and it's a text size as well as handwriting style, attribute that, I think that's actually an interesting observation. I don't know if you got to, kind of complete your points about the distinctiveness of this volume, but I would agree. In fact, I would almost warn anybody who was looking to this to be what the cover says, advertises it as, or even people who have read this, anthology in the past, I would just, caution's not the right word. I would almost sort of like, forewarn, forecast that I think Ben Katchor is doing something very distinctive, as you said, in this year's edition. And, my theory of the case, my thesis is that in an age of Trump, and that's alluded to quite often throughout the volume, and with the cover, where even though it's 2017, it has a sort of parodic 1984 cover.
Orwell's 1984.
That's right. Yeah, I feel like Katchor is trying to is responding, as many of us felt the need to respond in the last year, to the age of Trump, where we need to take language, very Trumpist language, like the grandstanding idea of calling something the best, and to kind of dismantle that, and so I feel like he very intentionally, and I feel like he signals this in his introductory material, tries to be really as underground as possible, kind of
right
against the sort of marketization of the graphic novel and sort of all the mainstream IP that's out there. You could very easily, showcase how, comics are everywhere now, and they're in the movies, and, they're this huge pop culture influence. And I think one of the responses Katchor seems to be, I would suggest, putting forward in these times is to dive even further into the margins that comics have always lived in, and to say, here's very alternative stuff from a very alternative medium, and to sort of revive that spirit.
Yeah, you mentioned the cover and its reference to Orwell's 1984. In fact, someone picking up this book may look at it and immediately think, oh, they were doing the Best American Comic Series way back in 1984, right, yeah. Because the cover does suggest as much. Yeah. But as Bill Kartalopoulos indicates in his foreword, which I want to comment on in a little bit, because I think this year's is specifically significant.
Yeah.
That is a political move, the decision to have the cover. Oh, and who does the cover? I can't remember who the cover artist is.
I'm going to look for that, right?
Yeah, I'm blanking. But it definitely had political intent. And I think both Bill, but especially Ben's introduction, which we can get to in a moment, really offbeat, again,
right.
Of course you expect that from Ben Katchor.
Right.
Very political. Not every comic in this anthology is overtly political or even political in a subtle sense, but there are some examples where you do have contemporary politics, especially right in your face. And I'm thinking in particular of Eli Valley's Schlonged.
Yes.
Where, he definitely takes a swipe at our current president.
Oh, yes.
Quote unquote president.
Right.
But, the other comics, if there's anything political about them, it may be a little more subtle to greater or lesser degrees.
Yeah,
but
it's cultural politics, yeah.
It is. I think this has to be another, I guess, a standout feature of the 2017 volume. I think it's the most political of the ones they've published so far. And again, given the times.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And just to go back, the cover art is by Matthew Thurber, who has a piece.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, part of that cultural politics is really, again, if I'm Ben Katchor and I'm thinking best American comics, that is such an imposing task, which, previous editors have responded to in various ways. And I just think that this is a certain kind of response, a response where, okay, if that has to be on the cover because the publisher requires it and that's what the series is called, sure. But I'm going to sort of be sort of low-key subversive about it. Because, it's a tall task and really impossible to capture the best of all that is out there in American comics. I mean, I had the same feeling that you did, where I usually come to these volumes and there's a little bit of confirmation. There's a little bit of like patting myself on the back because somebody has selected titles, and often I've read, at least a third, if not 2/3 of them. And I'll feel like pretty good about myself. Like, oh, I know I read a lot of these this year. And, this is a year, and we should say it's a 2017 volume, but it covers comics at the end of 2015 towards about August of 2016. This was a year where I read more comics than I ever have in my life. And I felt the same way you did. And I think, probably even well-read comics folks like us, would be expected to have that same experience of being, taken aback by some of these names that we have not only not read but never heard of. I think that's an intentional act on Katchor's part that I'm intrigued by, and I like it. I feel like there's this feeling, there's a sense about it that, and some of it does feel like it's more like a curated exhibit than a sort of a cross-cut of the sort of the best that's out there in American comics right now. And there's a certain avant-garde feeling about some of the works. But one of the things he intends to do, and I think we'll probably talk about this further, is he wants to, I think, among the suppressed voices in a culture of like a Trumpian best, is the voices of the differently abled. And so Katchor has really intentionally gone to exhibits rather than usual publications where they feature and cultivate and curate the art of people with developmental disabilities, for instance. And some of those artists are represented in here. Some of those are the ones that I didn't know before, and I'm glad for this project. But I think their inclusion was also an artistic choice on Katchor's part.
I agree, and you mentioned the eclectic nature of this volume and how it includes a number of comics, voices, especially those from the margins.
Yeah.
Katchor, I mean, obviously he does his own comics, right? There's the Julius Nipple stuff.
Right.
One of my favorite comics, really, and I've even done scholarship on this, is New York Jew, another one of his works. I mean, I absolutely love Ben's comics, but he does work in other media as well. In fact, I would say that he's really good at doing, let's say, transmedia studies.
Yeah.
And so I think yet another, I don't know if this is the fourth or fifth for me, distinguishing characteristic of the 2017 volume is that Katchor, more than the previous editors ever did, challenges our understanding or our definitions of comics.
Yes.
And in fact, reading this volume, there were times that I was pretty adamant. I said to myself, well, this is not really a comic, technically.
Yeah.
But that's okay, I think, because one of the things that he, I think, is doing by including much of this material is he is asking us to expand our definitions of what comics actually is.
Yeah.
I think maybe the closest editor who's done anything like that, in his career at least, if not in the volume, is Scott McCloud. But, again, Scott McCloud is not only a comics creator, but also, a comics critic, I would say a comics scholar.
Yeah.
And, he has from, the beginning of, or close to the beginning of his career with understanding comics, has made the argument that comics are not just those things we find in our newspapers or buy off the spinner rack or now in comic shops.
Right.
That, it has a very long tradition. And, he gives examples of that, and others have said, well, you're probably stretching that definition a little bit.
Right.
So I think McCloud has come the closest, but I think what Katchor has done in this volume is he's actually included a lot of these things that people would look at and said, this is more of a painting or a tapestry, not really a comic. Or these are illustrations with a few words to them, not what we would consider comics.
Right.
To some degree, I would agree with that. But again, I'm glad that he is pushing the envelope here.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can go both ways about it. And I agree with you about the sort of, if we define the medium or the form by more than just the cultural attachments, clearly we're not talking about just superheroes here, but we're also not just talking about the sort of like, the stereotypical Dan Clowes, a couple of people sitting at a cafe talking to each other kind of thing. And, I think McCloud on one hand is really kind of pushed toward a definition and then tried to push beyond a definition of what comics is. But I think back to McCloud's volume of this series, and that was the one that had, Raina Telgemeier and Saga, so there was plenty of hat tipping to what was at the time probably broadly considered mainstream, the best of comics. While Katchor here, I think you're right, it's a kind of a provocation to to really push the boundaries of what would be counted and including them in this volume. And it's a cool thing. In fact, I was looking up some of the artists, especially the lesser known ones, to me, and some of them really don't pop up a whole lot on a Google search, except for, say, a local newspaper saying, "Hey, local artist is included in this volume among Michael DeForge and people like that." And so that's it to me. To me, that's the intended effect. And so I don't know if you want to get into that introduction and the preface now, but maybe my favorite part of that whole thing is that Katchor includes a string of emails. I don't know if they're authentic emails, but it's his emails pleading to Bill Kartalopoulos, "Please give me a little more time because I saw this awesome exhibit and I want to include some of these in there." And so whether it's, real or artificial, they definitely frame this as, this is a little different. We're stretching to the boundaries to include a lot of stuff that you may not normally consider in this kind of anthology.
Yeah. Now, I think just a moment ago, did you use the word provocative in terms of describing Ben's approach? I like that. It provokes and it definitely challenges. And for that reason, I think that this is, I'm not going to say it's the best volume of Best American Comics because again, we're problematizing the word best here.
Sure.
I do think, though, that this is probably the most exciting volume because whether you agree with what Katchor has curated or not, whether you like it, whether you think it's, some of it's not even comics or what have you, it definitely doesn't allow you to, let's say, read passively. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, you mentioned McCloud's previous volume, which, did have Telgemeier, selection from Saga. Right. And, I mean, as great as those creators are, as those comics are, when you see things that are, let's say, unquestionably comics, and especially things that you recognize, there is the potential danger of reading that volume in a passive way, right? Because that they're comics, you may or may not already be familiar with that particular creator, and so you just take it in, and it does what you had mentioned earlier, right? You feel a sense of, say, hey, it confirms my good taste, because I'm already familiar with, if not these comics, these kind of comics,
right?
But Ben Katchor in the 2017 volume, it's like he throws down a gauntlet and says, I am not going to let you read this passively. I'm not going to give you a free ride.
Right.
I'm going to provoke you. I'm going to maybe at times piss you off. I'm going to make you hold the book close to your eyes because you can't read the print, and get you pissed off. Because I got pissed off at times having to, sit closer to the text. So, I appreciate that. I think this is the one volume that I have been the most engaged with actively.
Yeah, me too. I had the same response. And that's where I have the dual response and sort of the warning to friends, which is that I felt the same initially. And if you're going in as it has been, I think, at least the last few years, Kartalopoulos includes a list of notable comics in the back, and there you find all the expected characters. There's Patience by Clowes and Beverly by Gernasso and so on. There's the list if you are looking for some kind of canon, of good stuff from the year. But I think I was initially, that initial feeling of frustration or unfamiliarity. I think once I got past it and once I recognized what was going on, which I think the preface and introduction really got me there, past the table of contents, then I was all in for that ride. And so it's the kind of thing where I'd tell a friend, don't be misled by the Best American Comics 2017 title to think that this is meant to be some representative of what's critically lauded out there, so much as this particular project or provocation from Katchor's part. And for that, I'm all in. Absolutely.
Getting back to this whole idea of best, I've said on probably about every, or at least almost every episode of the Comics Alternative where we have looked at that year's Best American Comics volume.
Yeah.
I think it's a shame that it has the title that it does.
Right.
I mean, I can understand what they're doing here because Houghton Mifflin Harcourt has this best American series, right? Best American short stories, best American, sports writing, non-required reading, what have you. Yeah. And so this is part of that. So it has to have that best American title every year. I just wish they would call it something else because it is a little misleading, which is another reason why I appreciate Katchor's efforts in the 2017 volume, because there is this more, I guess, overt interrogation of best.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if I agree with you, I do think if I have another critique of it, and all of this qualified with the idea that Katchor is doing something specific. He's also picked pieces that I feel like have a certain, it's like a curated anthology of works that have a kind of something about the experience and the contemplation of art. And again, not to push us too far ahead, but I think the Gary Panter piece, which opens it, is almost like an opening salvo because it's he writes. I think Panter himself writes in the description, which again makes it feel even more like a curated museum. That there's this sort of biographical piece and a sort of artist statement at the beginning, but of every piece. But Panter writes that his short comic is for the analog and for the personal. It's for the things that you have to be present to witness. And I feel like one of the things that Katchor is up to is picking pieces, a lot of them that are introspective about art in an age of digital reproduction. Like they're really, a lot of them are a sort of a contemplation of art in these times. And I think that does convey a certain feeling that it's comics that are peering so intently on itself, on its own navel, that it's kind of warped, the picture, distorted a view of the medium. But on the other hand, I think it's all of it is very effective to me in that regard. So again, that's another way that I would sort of qualify the project is I would say, it's an awesome collection. It's also doing a few certain things that comics do, but it's not a representative of the various things that comics do. As an example, I think I at one point read like 6 or 7 pieces and thought, wow, none of those pieces so far that I just read had a single bit of dialogue between two characters that went beyond, like it's a lot of either narration or prose or characters speaking into the wind, like there's no snappy back and forth going on here. And, that to me was just, it's a certain kind of comics art too, if you're putting it under that umbrella. And it's a limited scope, and I think that's intentional as well. But, you've got to take that as it is.
Yeah, you mentioned Gary Panter's contribution opening this volume. It says a lot when Panter's contribution is one of the more conventional comics in the collection.
That's right.
And it is compared to the other experimental stuff that's in there.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, I do want to talk about Kartalopoulos's Foreword and then Ben Katchor's intro. But before we do that, I do want to comment on something that you alluded to earlier, and that is the notable comics section at the very back of the book. Now, for those who aren't aware, in every Best American Comics volume, there's always a section in the back, and it runs from, let's say, 3 to 4 pages usually, of kind of like also rans. They weren't collected, they weren't anthologized, but these are ones that the editors, along with Kartalopoulos, the series editor, feel that are important enough to at least mention. You don't have a sample of it, you don't have an excerpt, but check these out. Yeah. And, you mentioned that Klaus's Patience was listed there. To some degree, I was a little surprised that Patience didn't get excerpted in the 2017 volume. On the other hand, it didn't surprise me because in, 2016, when I went to SPX and went to the Ignatz Awards ceremony that first night, I was a little surprised that Klaus didn't get more attention. He was nominated for a few categories, 2 or 3. I can't remember how many, but I don't think he got any recognition. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I don't think he got any recognition. And I thought, wow, that's really off. So then after that experience, it doesn't really surprise me that Ben, I guess along with Bill, decided not to include Patience. Maybe they didn't think it was one of the best. I mean, who knows? But, from all of the hype that surrounded Patience's release a couple of years ago and the reaction and bests of lists from 2016, I would have thought it would have gotten maybe a little more recognition. But it is listed in the notable comics section.
Yeah. As are many of the things that I think did get that kind of attention probably at SPX, your Tilly Waldens and your Rosalie Lightning is on there. Basically, I think my top 10 list from last year is mostly represented in this notable comics list. So there is a place in this volume, those 3 pages, for people looking for, what did they, rave about at SPX? That is represented in that list pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I think that the only thing that is collected in this anthology, where we have an excerpt or sampling of, that was on my best of list for that particular year, I guess 2016, was the Bill Griffith excerpt from Invisible Ink, because Invisible Ink was one of my top 10 favorites of that year.
That's right. Yeah.
Not only do I enjoy the comics that are collected in the annual anthology, but I appreciate the introductions, not only from the volume's editor, but also from the series editor, Bill Kartalopoulos. And I think that the 2017 foreword that Bill contributes is probably his strongest since he's taken over as series editor. And, from Matt Madden and Jessica Abel.
Right.
And the reason why I feel that way is that I think he more clearly articulates the reason, or maybe even an argument, for a lot of this experimental stuff, right? Because not only is Katchor's collection very experimental, but in the past we've seen, maybe not as many, but a number of comics that kind of push the boundaries of, let's say, the typical comic story, if such a thing exists.
Yeah.
And the argument that Bill makes, and he starts off by doing this on the first page of his foreword, then on to the second, which is the first is lowercase Roman numeral 7 and then 8. He talks about that this is a really good time for comics, and there's so many ways for creators to get their work out here.
Right.
But then he says, I wish to celebrate the fact that our current vital era of comics still exists against all odds.
Yeah.
It is an uphill climb to make this work, and no true guarantees and little expectation of steady reward. Comics exist because artists are passionate about the art form and its possibilities for personal expression.
Right.
Precisely because those odds are so daunting, artists entering the field should engage the medium and take risks, expressive risks and artistic risks. In a field with no guarantees, compromising one's work to meet a perceived marketplace is a much riskier gamble than wholehearted, incautious engagement.
Right.
The odds of financial success are always low, but if an artist pushes his or her work as far as it can go, the changes for personal satisfaction and growth climb exponentially.
Right.
Personal creative ambition is a safer bet on its own terms than a career plan. And so basically what he's saying here, and then later on he goes on to further explore this, is that by a creator choosing to fall within, I guess, what we could loosely call, the mainstream comics formula, whether it's working for the big two or even not. I mean, a lot of people think of Image Comics as alternative. I don't.
Right.
I think that, they have a different business model than the big two, but nonetheless, it's basically the same kind of comics without the superhero twist that you find from the big two. And there's nothing wrong with that. I have nothing against what the big two, Image, Dark Horse, the premier publishers do.
Yeah.
But what Bill is arguing for here is that artists have to push the boundaries. They have to be a little more experimental. They have to find their own voice.
Right.
Because if they don't, not only will they have, let's say, less potential in terms of recognition, but even financial success. And so he's making the argument here that doing something different is not only good for an artist's integrity, but also for their checking account.
I think that's true. But at the same time, I feel like there's also an acknowledgement that what makes comics is that they exist on these borders and frontiers of how we express and tell stories. You know, the reason why movies, I think, right now are filled with comics, you know, intellectual property that comes from comics is that 30 years ago, that stuff was besodden as like trash material. Now it's upheld, but it's the stuff that spoke to people's, you know, imaginations and hearts. And now it's upheld as, you know, marketable stuff. And I got to say that one thing I liked about this volume, and where I think it's in keeping with those exact words that you read, as well as just a couple paragraphs down on, Roman numeral 8, he says, a culture will die without readers who are willing to read adventurously, to push beyond their comfort zones so that artists may push beyond theirs. Is that you could argue that with, you know, how well comics are doing these days in the mainstream culture and market, that there's not only a kind of commercial elite in terms of the big two and stuff like Image, stuff that, you know, makes a lot of money and becomes movie properties, but there's also a kind of almost literary elitism that occurs with comics where, we've canonized, you know, again, Klaus and
Spiegelman,
Spiegelman, Chris Ware, and maybe even the likes of Kevin Huizinga. And I think I just love that they pushed that this year, where there's people that, you know, you and I, who probably think of ourselves as pretty cultured highbrow comics readers, are, you know, taken aback. And I love that too, because we're being pushed to read adventurously. And I think that, you know, I think of Charles Hatfield's wonderful book, Alternative Comics. That is like core to the DNA of comics and why comics are so important. So this is a retrieval of that in many ways.
Now, Ben Katchor's introduction.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm not sure what to say about this or where to begin, except for this is definitely something different. And it is fragmentary. It's fragmented, but in a good and perhaps necessary way, because there are various parts to this, right? It begins with this one-page statement from this organization, the U.S. Chamber of Comics. And then the flyer is standing up for American cartoonists. Right. And in this organization, Ben Katchor apparently is the Senior Vice President Emeritus of International Strategy and Operation. And then we get another mock document, which I guess is a brochure about... it's called I Am a Cartoonist, Not a Mental Health Problem. And it basically goes through a variety of different personality types and the kind of comics that they draw, which I found particularly interesting. For instance, under the kind of comics, autobiographical comic strips, just read a little bit of it. It says, for comic strip makers with underdeveloped imaginative facilities, it's common to turn to a regurgitation of the details of their own life. The more pathetic or embarrassing the details, the better. Following the validated model of quote-unquote alternative comic strip drawings, a banal, schematized, cartoon-like image, these individuals are oblivious to the pain their autobiographical comics might cause to people in their social sphere. And then it goes on. But, I mean, there are other examples, comic strip as contemporary art, real or mainstream comics, the mashup style, the politically engaged cartoonist. And so basically in this mock brochure, what Katchor is doing is, he's really playing around, writing, in a voice that is, as he does in that previous one-pager, right? That brochure, I guess the flyer, The Triumph of American Comics, speaking in a voice that's a little reactionary. And we know it, though, right? I mean, I can't see someone picking up this book, reading the introduction, and feeling that, well, this must be how Ben Katchor feels.
Right. Yeah. And if you have that feeling at all, it's exploded by the next 2 pages, which is those, emails I mentioned earlier. And then the news story about the headline saying Feds raid Best of Racket editorial love nest. And I'll just pick out this meaty quote. Night Court Judge Marshall Buckram was visibly disgusted by the scale and blatant nature of this fraudulent operation, referring, of course, to Katchor and Kartalopoulos putting together this book. So there's some self-satire going on here, as well as satire the whole medium.
Yeah, and what are they doing here? I think if I remember correctly, what this crime is that Katchor has committed is that he is using prisoners and the kind of comics, quote unquote comics, that they create in order to further his work in Best American Comics, but he's doing so without paying the prisoners, and basically it's a scandal.
Right.
And we have this funny picture that looks almost like a mugshot of Katchor. Katchor in custody. I always thought of Katchor's sense of humor, and I get this not only from his comics, but also from, I've interviewed him a couple of times, once for the Comics Alternative and something else a little more formally, or at least print formally, because, our interviews on Comics Alternative are definitely formal.
Very formal. Very.
Yes, to some degree. But I always thought of his sense of humor as very subtle and dry.
Right.
I think, though, that in this introduction, the various pieces of this introduction, they're more satirically in your face. And so it's a different kind of Katchor humor that I'm accustomed to, and I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. And I think he's, in a way, resisting being co-opted by self-seriousness, which is always a temptation for art and culture, right? So, yeah, I like this.
So, as both of us have pointed out, a good number of these creators, and I haven't counted, but I would guess about a half of them I wasn't familiar with beforehand. And so, unlike you, I don't think maybe I looked 2 or 3 of them up.
Okay.
Others, though, I didn't.
Yeah.
And maybe I should have been a little more diligent about that. But, there are a number of creators here whose work I was familiar with, like, Sam, Alden, Bill Griffith, Tim Lane, Joe Sacco. And when I sat down to take a few notes for our recording today, one of the things I noted was what I called standout stories, and I made a list of them. And I went through a few of them, and I'll tell you what some of them are.
Yeah.
Kim Deitch's Shrine of the Monkey God, Tim Lane's Remembering the Millionaire Hobo, Gabriel Bell's excerpts from the July Diary 2016, Joe Sacco's Rent Crisis, John Hankiewicz's De Hooch, Ethan Persoff and Scott Marshall's John Wilcock New York Years, Sam Alden's Test of Loyalty, Sami Alwani, The Dead Father, and Bill Griffith's excerpt from Invisible Ink. Now, those are the ones that I just listed. Others I enjoyed, I just didn't list them. But as I was making this list, one of the things that occurred to me is, I'm primarily listing people I already knew about, like Bill Griffith and Joe Sacco. Of that list that I just read to you, there are only 3 creators or creative teams that I was not familiar with previously, and that was Hankiewicz's and his De Hooch comic, Persoff and Marshall with their John Wilcock's New York Years, and then Sami Alwani, The Dead Father. But the rest of them, like Tim Lane, Gabriel Bell, Joe Sacco, I already knew them. And so I was wondering, am I privileging these guys because I already know their work? I mean, I absolutely love Kim Deitch. I've done a couple of interviews with him, and I just love his work. Shrine of the Monkey God, I think this is the 3rd time I've seen it collected.
Yeah, it is. In fact, he says that in the... in the introduction or his statement.
Yeah, it has gotten so much mileage over the past couple of years. It's just phenomenal. But again, it's Kim Deitch, and I wouldn't expect anything less. But again, I'm familiar with these people. Again, Tim Lane, Kim Deitch, Joe Sacco, Sam Alden. And I was wondering as I was making this list, am I, and I know I'm biased here, and this is completely subjective, some of those more experimental pieces by creators whose names I was not familiar with, I appreciate, but it may not resonate with me as emotionally, maybe intellectually, but not as emotionally and intellectually as something like, let's say, Shrine of the Monkey God.
Right. Yeah. No, I felt the same way. I mean, there's a familiarity to the language with which they speak. And if this was the first Michael DeForge I ever read, I would have thought, wow, this is one of these sort of off the beaten path experimental folks that, Katchor dug up somewhere in some weird exhibit. but it's Michael DeForge. So I was like, oh, I know what this is, And so it may have been that the familiarity helped to breed the comfort level. Mm-hmm. I also think that there is a certain way that those more established creators speak in a familiar language to us. Obviously some of the formal characteristics that we're used to, and some of the more experimental stuff, how you enter that or how you are able to respond to it emotionally, I found for myself, would take more time. And I think that was, again, part of the mission. In fact, it seems almost calculated the way that they're interspersed. Right? There's not like a section of like, here are the hits. Another section of here's the, weird web only or self-published thing that no one else has seen. It seems like it mixed with each other in a very intentional way. And so although there's way less commentary in this volume as there has been in previous volumes about the logic and the organization and the ordering of these, I sense a intention that things would be placed side by side that would eschew the sort of like, stereotypical, like, here's this category and here's that category. So Kim Deitch is right next to the Ben Duncan work, which I didn't know too well. And then a lot of these artists who are part of these, sort of art collectives for folks with disabilities are really interspersed with, your again, Michael DeForge's and Sam Alden's and stuff like that. And so that seems to be given the project here, I think that was a really exciting way to read for me to go. And I went basically cover to cover with this book. Mm-hmm. For me to go from something that I was like, okay, I'm pretty familiar with Gary Pancher to, wow, I've never seen this kind of thing before, Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned the Ben Duncan piece. Mm-hmm. And we have two contributions from Ben Duncan: "Get in where you fit in," and then "Molt." And I'm looking at this and I'm asking myself, well, why didn't I include that in one of my list of standout stories? Because I enjoyed this. It's weird. It's kind of gross in places, but I liked it. Yeah. And then the one before that, Dan Zetwalk's, again, he has two pieces: "Communication Workers of America," and then "Coffee Lids of Greater Old Red Falls." Actually, this is one I probably should have listed, but maybe just forgot to. Maybe it was because it was toward the very beginning of this volume, and that's why I didn't include it. But yeah, I really did like Zetwalk's, and I guess that's how you pronounce his name, piece, especially "Communications Worker of America." I like the art, and I also like the layout of his comic. And again, this is one of those pieces that, especially if it's late at night and you have tired eyes, you're going to have to hold closer to your face to take in, and not only the words, but the art, because it's quite intricate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, actually, that work, and you were talking about the sort of structure of the page, makes use of the sort of, I mean, it's not just a panel layout, really. It's sort of a form of, I mean, every page of comics is not just a panel layout. It's a form of artistic expression, but it's not sort of subservient to storytelling. As you said, it's not easy to read or know where to go next with your eyes. But it's really sort of almost like an art piece itself. And that actually reminds me a little bit of Good Haven High, which is a piece by an artist named Oscar Asmidia. I hope I'm saying that right. But that's one of the artists who is sort of self-identified Asperger syndrome, so, on the autism spectrum, and whose work is, every page is sort of a painting with, panels, a painting of a building, which is basically a schoolhouse, because it's about their high school experience, and every panel, it looks like a room in the schoolhouse. And so there's a little bit of an echo to me to those, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. What were we? Oh, the Zetwalk. The
Zetwalk,
yeah. Of how the page is used, and how both of those really look more like they belong on a wall, and as an art exhibit than on a page. But it's nice to be able to take them in here on the page.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of connecting Zek Walk's and Osmedia, if that's how you pronounce his last name, Good Haven High, in that way. But you're right. Both of them do challenge the way we read comics in terms of taking it in and how we directionally read. I know that with Zek Walk, instead of reading, let's say, horizontally, right, where, you go from upper left over to upper right, then down to the next line or the next series of panels or the band of panels or strip, and so on and so forth. With Zek Walk's Communication Workers of America, there's more of a reading vertically. And just because of the way that the art and the panels kind of interconnect with one another. And I mean, you do read across horizontally, but I think more than any other comic in this collection, you're encouraged to go up and down.
Right. Yeah. And something about those kind of structural experiments or whatever, the different way, it seems to me it's probably reflective thematically. That Communication Workers of America piece, a little bit about like sort of contemporary commercialized religion, sort of like the transition from old timey religion to a kind of like hip, and it's a pastor who's the son of a pastor who's also head of a heavy metal band or something like that, and so I think there's a little bit of tweaking or poking at the kind of edifices of belief and institutions and stuff like that in the way that it plays with the arrangement of physical panels. There's something, I think meant to look like an old house or a church or a steeple in the structure of these things. And I think that's intentional and probably beyond my interpretive ken to tease out.
We were discussing, or at least I was mentioning, Kim Deitch's Shrine of the Monkey God.
Yeah.
And that was originally collected in Kramers Ergo, which came out last year. And, this year's volume of Best American Comics has me wanting to go back and reread Kramers Ergo, because I remember reading it last year and I thought, it's okay. It didn't really hit me on the gut level. I mean, obviously Kim Deitch's piece did. I mean, I loved it from the very beginning. But the other contributions, I thought, I guess they're okay, but it's nothing I'd write home about. And because I thought that, maybe I would feel impelled to put it on my best of list for 2016, but I didn't. But we have, what is it? At least 3 contributions.
A lot, yeah. I mean, if somebody were to criticize Katchor, it would be for essentially going to a bunch of off the beaten path museum exhibits and then pulling from Kramers Ergo, and he was done.
So is it Ergot or Ergo?
That's a good question. I've heard both. You'd think it'd be Ergo, but I don't know. I was going to ask you the same.
I don't know.
But volume 9, I guess.
Ergo, Ergot. Let's call the whole thing off.
Let's call the whole thing off, right? You say Ergo, I say Ergot. But yeah, there are probably 4 or 5, I think, even pieces from Kramers 9.
Okay, so I know there, in addition to Deitch's Shrine of the Monkey King, there is the Lael Westvind piece, Cannibal Ball.
Yes.
And then there is Matthew Thurber, the aforementioned Matthew Thurber's Kill Thurber, which I thought was pretty good story.
Yeah.
What other pieces are from Kramers Ergo?
Ooh, I'll have to look. I'm trying to see if, I think I noted that. I'll have to look. I could be wrong. You might be right that there's only 3, but
even at 3, that seems to be a lot for this one volume.
Right. Yep.
Another thing in terms of where Ben, and I guess Bill as well, was pulling from for the 2017 volume, this has to be the one volume that has the most excerpts or contributions from self-published comics that I've seen. I mean, every issue or every volume of Best American Comics, the annual anthology, has some work that's self-published. But I think that there's significantly more in the 2017 collection than there has been in the previous ones. And in fact, as I was reading this book, and like you, I read it from front to back. I kept making notes for me to let's say, go to John Porcelina's Spit and a Half website. It's like, I got to see if I can get the original self-published comic somewhere. I wonder if he has it. Because I wanted to check these guys out. I mean, I really do love zines and self-published comics like that. And there's a lot of it in here. And so that's another way in which Ben Katchor's collection got me excited. It provoked me. It got me excited. It did, everything it needed to.
Yeah. Even creators that I think probably you and I are more familiar with, like even the Hip Hop Family Tree piece was not from the books, but from the Boing Boing. I don't know if they were the initial or later, pieces, or the Gabrielle Bell is the self-published on the web Gabrielle Bell, not the, uncivilized or whatever Gabrielle Bell. I don't know where that fits in, whether that works with as far as time and stuff like that. But I just mean that there are some places, the Joe Sacco, for instance, where you could have turned to some works published through, a more well-known publisher, but instead they went after the self-published piece.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that did strike me, you were talking about Gabrielle Bell and her website. One of the things that did strike me about this year's volume, and, I'll have to go back and look at the previous annual volumes to refresh my memory on this. Mm-hmm. I do think that where Kartalopoulos and company are a little behind the curve in terms of these best of volumes, not as much attention paid to webcomics. Right. I mean, there is some representation in this one, I think, maybe a little stronger than in previous ones. But, I can understand this to a point because, doing the webcomic series with Sean as we do monthly, webcomics, I swear, they're so damn intimidating and overwhelming. There's just so much out there.
Right.
Because it is relatively easier to produce comics online than it is to find a publisher to actually put them out. So, I think that there's a grand proliferation over the past decade, especially of webcomics. And so there's so much out there to sift through. And of course, there's a lot of chaff, but there's also quite a bit of really good wheat.
Sure.
And maybe in future volumes, there'll be an editor who is much more attuned to the webcomic scene.
Right.
But that's something that I think maybe needs a little more attention within the Best American Comic Series as a whole. And, who knows, maybe Bill Kartalopoulos will email me after hearing this and say, hey, you don't remember what, A, B, C, D from these volumes? It's like, okay, you're right. I guess I was off base. But I just don't have a sense of webcomics. Now, I understand why there's hardly any, even in the notable comics section in the back, listing or representation of, let's say, Big Two, especially mainstream, but even non-Big Two mainstream comics, because of permission rights issues. And I can understand that, right? Because if publishers like DC or Marvel are going to either not allow something to be republished or are going to charge exorbitant prices in order to do so, then you don't include them.
Right.
At least within the anthology as a whole. There's something else about the notable comics. We can talk about that later. But I can understand that. But when it comes to something like webcomics, I think that it would be much easier to get permission because the vast majority of
happy
webcomics
to have
creators,
it, right?
Sure, Can I pay you to publish me?
Exactly. Yeah. I wondered about that too, and I think broadly for the series, that's an exclusion that is a problem, and probably going forward. Actually, I don't have a relationship with Bill Kartalopoulos, but I want to nominate you to edit one day, Derek, because I think you'd get the warp and woof of the industry so well, the medium so well. But I think the other thing about the lack of webcomics makes me think of is that a lot of these works are about, I said this earlier, but like the materiality of art, or about how there's a lot of artifice involved in contemporary culture. And so a lot of it kind of harkens back or hails back to times when things were things and people had to go to places to witness things, as I said before, the Gary Panter piece, but also some of the pieces about artists. Actually, funny enough, the DeHooch and the de Kooning pieces, allude a little bit to art and artifice and, the idea of having, I guess, all this visual stuff that we do, not replace or remove us from actual physical presence and attention to human lives. I feel like that's a part of the thing that, maybe Katchor is trying to push against our, reality TV president and culture, with a reminder about the materiality of all this great stuff that we are so quickly leaving behind.
Yeah. And I think that gets us back to a point that I brought up a moment ago, and that is there's more self-published comics represented here than in previous volumes. And, one of the things I really appreciate about comics that are self-published, in zine form or what have you, in other words, the kind of things that you're probably more apt to find at a con like Small Press Expo, right?
Right.
Or I guess TCAF. I've never been there, but I think it's like a Canadian Small Press Expo.
Yeah.
Or SPX is, a U.S. TCAF.
Right.
There's something much more physical and tangible about these kind of zines or self-published comics that you don't get in material that's mass-produced, either in book or in pamphlet or serial comic book form. And there's something about that materiality that you kind of lose when reproducing this in other means. But I think that giving this kind of self-published material the amount of attention that Ben Katchor's volume is doing is to the book's benefit. I mean, I hesitate to say that this is my favorite Best American Comics volume because every volume has its pluses, right? Things that really stand out and make it unique. But again, Ben in many ways is provocative. He is pushing the boundaries and getting people engaged and, asking us to question what are comics. And I really love all of that he's doing in here.
Yeah. And I think he's also doing something, as you were saying that, it reminded me of the 2010 piece by Josh Bayer, where Bayer, who people know from Theth and the All-American Comics this last year, and who has quite a bit of that nostalgia bone in his own work, his piece talks about king shit, which I take to mean maybe King Syndicate, but like juxtaposing king shit with it really like sums up what it is, because you have these characters that look like Crazy Cat and Annie and Garfield,
right?
But it's with this sort of warped Theth like atmospherics, and they're doing crude stuff and all this kind of stuff. And then at the very last page of his piece, there's this bearded, Josh Bayer explains his own piece, Comics 2010. And he says, it's funny to look at this old stuff. It's lying around like these old family photo albums, to look at these old comics. And of course he published this in the year, but he drew it in 2010. And that last page is his own retrospective reflection, He says, looking at these old comics that I drew, it mirrors the time that's passed. And so there's a certain amount of that impulse that Bayer expresses that I think this whole volume is also doing, is before time moves by and before we, move everything digital and everything becomes, on the web or whatever, and easily accessible, let's pause to make sure we are looking at the physical paper of the stuff that we picked up at SPX 5 years ago and taking heed of what's there before it all passes by.
Mm-hmm. I was turning to the Bayer piece that you were just discussing, and I flipped by the piece that comes right before that in the anthology, and this is something that is untitled by Bailey Jean Thomas, and this originally appeared in the Paris Review. Now, this is probably, at least to my memory, the very first time in the Best American Comics that something from the Paris Review was included. Because it's not, I guess, and maybe I'm forgetting something, but it's not as if the Paris Review is known for comics.
Right.
Right. The reason I'm mentioning this is one of those pieces that if I didn't see within the context of the Best American Comics 2017 and someone said, well, what is this? Is this a comic? I would say, oh, no way, definitely not. It's not necessarily like a work of art, for instance, like you would see in the typical, if there's such a thing, museum, like a painting or something like that. I wouldn't know exactly what to call it, but I wouldn't call it a comic.
Right.
And yeah, it's one of those aforementioned contributions where you don't know what it is, and Ben Katchor has been going to various museums and looking for things to include here that, again, kind of challenge our understanding of sequential storytelling. And I think the same thing can be said for William Tyler's piece, which we have the introductory material on page 209.
Yeah.
4 untitled pieces. And again, if I would see this outside of the context of the book and someone asked me, is this a comic? I would say, oh, no, not at all. I said, it may bear certain characteristics that define comics, at least as I understand them, but I wouldn't call it a comic. And I would even say, maybe to a lesser degree, and this is on page 319, Dapper Bruce Lafitte's I Am Better Than Picasso. I mean, this is another piece like the previous 2 I mentioned that appeared in a gallery. Right. And this is, I don't know, it's like more of a tapestry. It's not a tapestry, but it's more of a collage or a mural. But again, this does arguably tell a story sequentially. Right. So yeah, I guess it's more of a comic in the Scott McCloud sense than the other 2. But again, these are pieces that were exhibited in galleries or museums and aren't necessarily comics, but they're included in Best American Comics.
Yeah. I mean, those pieces, as you said, that experimental push on that feeling of consensus growing around what makes comics that I think Understanding Comics initiated, which is, okay, well, if it's words and pictures, that's not necessarily comics. That could be a children's book. That could be some kind of, printmaking, who knows? But if it's sequential and then we start being familiar with that as comics. But I think a lot of these things are kind of pushing on that. What does it mean to be sequential? What counts as a narrative, and how much does it have to spell out a story in sort of genre familiar ways for it to be a narrative? And I do think that even things that, I just think about how, and we'll talk about this in our best of conversation, I'm sure, but even the way that, my favorite thing is Monsters is killing it this year. That's the universally acclaimed work of the year. And the way that formally pushes against the expectations of comics, and I think of things like Linda Berry's Syllabus. So I just think that we are in territory that, the familiar expectations of panels and left to right or right to left ordering and so on are just being defied, and it's cool. It's interesting. Yeah.
Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore.
No, we're not. We are not in Kansas. Yeah. Another thing that I thought to ask you about is what you thought about the more, you'd mentioned this earlier, but the more political pieces. I'm thinking, for instance, of course, of the Eli Valley, which I think is a great nod to what's going on with the nib and the sort of cultural presence of the nib, but also Sam Olden's Test of Loyalty piece, which is, I think, an interesting commentary about technology as well as politics. But that bit about a somebody who's working on the set of is it a TV show or a movie? But it's sort of the near future, and then these drones show up.
YouTube production.
Oh yeah, that's right. Some kind of web video production. That's right. And, everybody has, a drone shows up and everybody has to hold up a literal green card. And, Noelle, the sort of main character, has to hold up a red card because her visa status is expired, or, she wasn't able to renew it. And then that drone starts, doing drone things. So, I mean, I think there's some really pointed political pieces, statements throughout the book as well.
Yeah, I really liked Alden's piece, Test of Loyalty, the one that you're referring to. And I'm looking, at the beginning of this, and this originally appeared on Hazlitt.net. So again, that's something that appeared on the web, technically a web comic, and kind of undermines what I said a moment ago. But that's one of the pieces, Test of Loyalty, that I was referring to toward the top of our conversation when we were talking about the political nature of the 27 volume. I mean, there's some pieces like Eli Valley's that are really overtly in your face, and I love, but there's some more subtle things. So I think what Alden's doing here is he's making a political statement without being as, let's say, overt or out there as Eli Valley. But then again, if you read Eli Valley's comics, either on the Nib or in other places, I mean, he is very much in your face.
Yeah, right.
Which I appreciate about his work. And also, I mean, another thing about Valley, and for years I've been thinking about having Eli come on the show for an interview. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Sure. But I mean, I love the fact that he's not afraid to piss off people. Especially his, if you want to call them his own people. Right. I'm sure he gets a lot of response from the Jewish community that is not very supportive, let's just say.
Yeah.
Because of some of the stances he takes, especially against Israel.
Yeah.
But or at least the Netanyahu government.
Right.
But yeah, I really liked the Alden piece. I thought it was one of the stronger ones. I did have that in my list of standout stories, which again, admittedly, is very subjective. But again, I like Alden's work. I'm familiar with it, and so this was. I won't call it kind of comfort food reading, but again, it's familiar reading. I knew what to expect when I saw a Sam Alden piece.
Yeah.
Now, something that I didn't know what to expect is the piece that came, I think it's right before that, and that is the one by Ethan Persoff and Scott Marshall, I think another self-published work. John Wilcock, New York Years, 1954 through 1971.
Yes.
And, honestly, I did not know anything about Wilcock and what he did in terms of the Village Voice. And so this was a little education for me, but I tell you, I love not only the art in this rather long excerpt, but also the way that the style in which they tell the story, because you don't have a consistent form of, let's say, biography of Wilcock.
Right. Yeah, it actually, to me, it's of a piece with the Tim Lane piece earlier in the book. Which was the sort of similar, a biographical look at somebody I didn't know, but who seems important, interesting, significant. Somebody named James Eads Howe, who was a sort of known as the billionaire hobo, sort of lived the hobo life of traveling, looking for work, itinerant, the way that, hobos in contrast to tramps and bums were, but funded, because he actually was wealthy, a college for hobos and things like that. And both that and the Wilcock's biography both spoke to the idea of a kind of alternative underground lifestyle that I think is also a kind of politics, not just the overtly political pieces, but those ways of remembering that you can live in a different way. You can be a different kind of media, or you can, deal with, I guess, poverty and work opportunity in a different way were, really interesting. And I think important statements in this time as well. So I did like those. Both of those were high in my list on this book.
Yeah, you mentioned Tim Lane's Remembering the Millionaire Hobo. This is one of those pieces that's an example of what you mentioned toward the beginning of our conversation, and that is something that kind of confirms what you think of as your own good taste. I mean, I've loved Tim Lane's work for years. Late last year, I had him on the Comics Alternative for an interview, and we talked about, I think, the new incarnation of Happy Hour in America through Fantagraphics. And, of course, we talked a lot about hobos, as we did when I interviewed him for the blog a couple of years ago. And he has a thing for hobos and the hobo life in the last at least several issues of Happy Hour in America. Oh, okay. But, this piece, Remembering the Millionaire Hobo, originally appeared both in the Riverfront Times in St. Louis, which he used to write for, but also Happy Hour in America #6 when it was self-published. So another example of self-published work.
Yeah. And actually another example that I also kind of put in a category together, although it was interspersed, as I said earlier, not, define the categorization, was the Joe Sacco piece, which was called
that was
Crisis.
Very political, yes.
Yeah. And also, it was very overtly political, because the whole thing was sort of part of the campaign of a woman, I'm going to say this wrong, Chloe Eudaly, who was running for Portland City Council. And I think maybe in the statement mentioned won that seat. But dealing with, housing issues and gentrification in the city, things like that.
Yeah. As I flipped back to that Sacco piece that you just referenced, I passed by something that I enjoyed, and for some reason, I don't know why I didn't put it in my standout stories list. Maybe I should just include the entire volume as standout stories, because now I'm second-guessing my original list. And this begins on page 116, is Bjorn Miner's, or I guess it's Miner, Daisies. It's an excerpt from, again, another self-published work, Samson. Right. And Samson, issue number 3. There's something about Miner's art that really struck me. It's not overly sophisticated, and I think that's part of it, but also it has a visual tone that looks like something is old. I mean, physically old, like the paper and the ink has been worn down over time.
Sure. Like it kind of, Piscor does this a little bit, but not quite with the same color palette that creates that feeling.
Yeah.
It reminds me a little of Megan Mogg too. There's a little bit of that in the Hanselman stuff.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Piscor. I'm glad that parts of Hip Hop Family Tree were excerpted here. Again, why I didn't include it in my standout, I don't know, because I love Hip Hop Family Tree. I am not a rap or hip hop fan by any stretch of the imagination. I don't listen to it. No. I can appreciate it, but I don't listen to it, and but I love what Piscor has been doing these past several years with this history of hip hop, and so I'm glad to see that he gets excerpted here. And this is really good. And maybe the reason I didn't include it in my standout list is because I already knew it, and so it was like in many ways kind of old hat, but old hat in a good way.
Sure. Yeah. I think there's so many, and we could talk for quite a long time, I'm sure, about each of these pieces. And what I noticed, similar to you, was not only a little bit of excitement, but also a little bit of like relief when I came to, say, your Ed Piscors and pieces that were familiar. And I realized pretty soon, and this became part of my Google research in doing this, that many of the ones that were unfamiliar were ones that were I mentioned earlier, Oscar as Media, but also I'm trying to find which piece here in my notes here, but William Tyler's 4 Untitled Pieces, and a couple of others were part of something called the Creative Growth Studios, and on their website, they talk about serving artists with developmental and physical and mental disabilities. And I realized that some of the ones that were not only unfamiliar, but also I didn't sort of latch onto immediately were a representation of differently abled voices. And I think one of the things that there's some introspection in here. I'm like, on one hand, I was like, oh, am I not, am I not giving them their due because I don't know them, or is there actually something qualitatively different in the work? And then I started to think about, and I work with differently abled kids all the time as an educator, like, how do I read, recognizing that, there's different kinds of narration and different kinds of self-expression that are going on here. How do I read this? And do I read differently, or do I maintain the same standards of evaluation that I do, with the other artists on the list? And I realized that tension within me about how I read, with the knowledge that some of these people are differently abled, is exactly what I should be doing, which is struggling with that. Because I think, I think one of the things about, I think disability studies has helped me to understand is the way that we expect and want the comfort of everybody to be this able-bodied ideal. And, there's a resistance for many of us who don't count ourselves as disabled to being in some way, quote unquote, inconvenienced by, having to understand things by different standards or approach things from different perspectives. And I realized that discomfort in me was part of the ways that this volume was pushing me, and I appreciated that. And then going back and looking, there's quite a lot to either chuckle at or, sympathize with in a lot of those pieces that come from those artists that are here. And so I was really glad for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before we wrap up, I do want to say a few things and ask you your thoughts on the notable comics section in the back. But before that, I want to ask you something. Okay, on page 330, we have the contribution from, and this is a pen name or a pseudonym, Laura Pall Mall. This is really Jason Lee. And the piece is Picaresque. And it originally appeared in yet another self-published comic, Sporgo, issue number 1.
Right.
As I was reading Picaresque, I kept having the feeling that I have seen this before, but for the life of me, I cannot remember where or when I would have seen it. Have you seen this previously?
I hadn't. No, I did think that was an interesting piece. I wondered if we were going to talk about it, but I hadn't seen it before. I thought it was really intriguing, though. What was it that... it's reproduced in a lot more. It's pretty long, for the excerpts in this book. But what did you make of that piece?
I enjoyed it. I thought that, interestingly enough, this was one of the more conventional comics of the collection in what it does. In that, the art's a little different, but in terms of Pall Mall's storytelling through the medium of comics, I thought it did what the vast majority of comics, when we think of comics, do.
Sure.
Tell a kind of coherent story through sequential panels, yada yada yada.
Yeah.
But there's something about it that I can't help but think I've seen this before. But maybe I haven't. Maybe it's kind of a deja vu phenomena.
Yeah, it's wonderfully moody. And I said earlier that there weren't a lot of pieces that had actual discourse back and forth between the characters. This is an exception to that,
right?
For sure. And it's got some great moment by moment, sequence that. Yeah, I like that piece. I don't know what to make of it too, though, which is part of my feeling about it. But yeah.
Okay, so in the back of every volume of Best American Comics, there is a notable comics section that covers the same time period as the rest of the volume, right? So it's, the 1st of September for 1 year to the following year, August 31st, is when they accept submissions. And, you mentioned something earlier that I think is really true, and that is you can go through this list, and many of these are the people that I would consider some of the better creators and contributions of, if quote unquote, best of that particular year. And I'm just looking down this list. I'm not going to go through every name that I recognize, but Chester Brown, Mary Wept Over the Feet of Jesus. I think that was on my list.
Right. Yeah.
In last year, I guess it was, or 2016. And I thought it was a really good book. I love what Chester Brown does. It's a notable comic. It's not in the anthology proper. There's a Lily Carré, Nina Bunyevac, who I think did phenomenal work. Roz Chast, Daniel Klaus, we mentioned, Al Columbia, Jordan Crane. Issue number 5 of Uptight, Julie Duché. Theo Ellsworth, Jules Pfeiffer, Cousin Joseph is in the notable section. Sammy Harcum, Tom Hart. You mentioned Rosalie Lightning, which was on many people's best of list last year.
Yeah.
Kevin Huizinga,
Beto and Jaime.
Tony Millionaire, Maquis. I love the Maquis. I wouldn't expect Maquis to be in a volume of Best American Comics, but I still love Maquis. Dash Shaw, Escape from Nostalgia World, his piece in a Free Comic Book Day work. Joss Simmons, Art Spiegelman, Jeremy Sorsay, Curveball, Leslie Stein, Jillian Tamaki, Tilly Walden, as you mentioned, and Lauren Weinstein. So, there are a lot of big, and just scratching the surface. Mike Mignola. In fact, Mignola is probably the one name on this list that I would consider mainstream.
Dark horse, yeah.
And, one of the things I don't want to do is to second guess the editors of the volume of Best American Comics. So why didn't you include that? Or shouldn't you have included this, whether it's mainstream or not?
Right.
Now, I understand, as I said previously, why a lot of mainstream material isn't included in the anthology excerpts. One, because it may not be where the editors or Bill Kartalopoulos is wanting to go, then that's fine. But also there are permission rights issues, so I understand that. The thing about the notable comics section at the end, you don't need permission rights to list a title and a name.
Yeah.
And I know that in past volumes, I've been struck by the lack of what we could broadly define as mainstream comic titles listed there. I think this year there are fewer mainstream titles. Again, I mean, the only one that really stands out to me is the Mignola Hellboy in Hell number 9 and 10.
Right.
Other than that, I cannot see any mainstream creators. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. This is not necessarily where Bill, who created this list, is wanting to go. But it's something interesting to ponder.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess I had a couple feelings about this list. One, it did that thing that we were talking about earlier, that confirmation that I have good taste. So thanks, Bill. but I and it is for for the scope that it tries to take, pretty wide ranging. And so you have, to add to the list that you named, you have your Jason Shigas, right? Mm-hmm. You have CC Bell from the Comic Squad books, which are, definitely a young reader, collection that's there, And then there's all those things that you named. I would say that, it's hard to put a label on what they seem to be excluding. I would say that a lot of it is the not green pages of previews. And the stuff that exists in the direct market more,
right, in the back half,
yeah, and some of that is so we're talking here about the stuff that I mean, you go into a lot of comic shops and it's organized differently, the IDWs, the Titans, the Image, Valiant, Dark Horse. That's mostly what's excluded and why Mignola is an exception. And so, on one hand, I think that Kartalopoulos is certainly saying, look, even non-quote-unquote mainstream stuff is diverse and interesting. And so there's enough attention paid in other places to those segments. So let's spend our space honoring the good stuff within this segment. I also think that there's something that kind of goes against the spirit of the volume to again have this. And so I'm not opposed to including these notable comics, but it's sort of like we just got this awesome tour through the alternativeness of comics, and then we need to have this list to again ratify that these are like our sense of some canon. And I don't know, part of me resists that, and part of me also just am relieved to find that this sense of taste is reflected here. So I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it. To me, it's a little bit like how in the introduction Kartalopoulos takes pains to really point out how different this collection is and how sort of subversive it is, but also takes time to mention the fact that Ben Katchor won a MacArthur Genius Award, which is notable certainly, but again, it's like sort of you have that veneer of the respectability that the whole project is meant to put on certain works, and then at the same time you're pushing against that, and that's a tough tightrope to walk in, and I'm not blaming anybody for it, but I just see that contradiction all throughout the book.
Yeah, I have nothing about this notable list in the back. I mean, I love a lot of the things that I recognize, and I'm sure that the things that I don't know I would really enjoy as well. So I have no problem with this list, but where issues may arise, and this may even be a non-issue, really, is that I could see, quote-unquote regular comic readers. In other words, the Wednesday Warriors, right? The people whose idea of comics is primarily the big two mainstream stuff. Right. Picking up this volume and being turned off and saying, there's nothing here for me. And I say that because I've heard so many of those kind of readers. Nothing wrong with that kind of reading, by the way. But I've heard so many of those kind of readers on a variety of comics podcasts speak with less interest about, let's say, the Eisner Awards, because they feel that the Eisner Awards are given to works and creators that are not in their wheelhouse. In other words, their game in comics is vastly different from the mainstream game, the superheroes and company.
Yeah,
so
the
they don't want,
stuff,
they don't want to have anything to do with it. Okay.
Yeah.
And that can be a turnoff and an inadvertent turnoff. I have no problem with Eisner Award winners, right? And who's selected. Except for the fact that the Comics Alternative has not been selected for anything yet.
Please have a podcast category. Please consider us.
We are journalism. We are comics scholarship and criticism.
Hey, Derek works his butt off, and he's smart. Come on.
But I can see a Wednesday Warrior kind of reader picking this up and saying, there's nothing in here for me. I don't want to read it.
Yeah, no, that's true. And, when I said at the beginning of this conversation, my whole thing about how I'd qualify this when I gave it to somebody, that's real life, because every year around the holidays, I start buying holiday gifts. And most often what I give to most of my friends these days is comics, and usually they're comics that I give them. And most of my friends are non-comics readers on a regular basis. And most of the time I'm giving them comics to kind of say, look, there's stuff in this medium somewhere that speaks to you, and I'm thankful for a diverse set of friends for whom I get to give away a diverse set of comics. Mm-hmm. But I kept thinking, who would I give this Best American Comics Volume to? And I would only give it to somebody who was versed in comics, because anybody else would be like, this is super duplicitous, it purports to show me something that I don't recognize that as comics when you talk about comics, Paul, or when I, hear about comics in the media. And so, it's a challenging thing. It's an impossible task that's taken on in this book. But I do share with you, I think, applause for Katchor and Kartalopoulos doing something really interesting and unique here.
Yeah, very outstanding. Well, Paul, there you go. Our discussion of the Best American Comics 2017. And as we said at the top of the show, it's a little late, but again, better late than never, right?
Appreciate everybody listening and still tuning in, despite the fact that we're thoroughly 2018 now.
Yeah, exactly. But a lot of these comics didn't even come out in 2017.
That's true.
They came out in 2015, 2016. So in many ways, these volumes, the Best American Comics, are evergreen. That's right. So
that's why I own all of them.
That's right. Yeah, me too. And if you want to find great comics like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and every single month you're going to find incredible, unbelievable, and mind-blowing specials. Now, unfortunately, they are not listing Best American Comics 2017 on either the DCB Service site or their sister company, In Stock Trades. But if you want to get a copy of Best American Comics 2017, and we strongly recommend that you do, then definitely go to our website, comicsalternative.com, check out our show notes for this episode, and if you click on the title, your browser will carry you over to Amazon. Buy the book there, and you will throw, in essence, a few cents back to the two guys with PhDs talking about comics, and we appreciate that.
That we do. Yes, we do.
And after you do read the Best American Comics 2017, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of the 2017 anthology. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also reach out to us by email. Our email is 2guys@comicsalternative.com. That's the letters TWO. Or you can reach me I'm at paul@comicsalternative.com. And Derek is at Derek, DEREK, @comicsalternative.com. We're always looking out for your correspondence and your feedback. So let us know.
That's right. Definitely email us, but you can also contact us through a variety of other means. We're all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and we have a Slack channel. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. Thanks, Derek, for having me, and everybody out there, live life to the lees. Enjoy your reading.
That's right. And Paul and I will be back soon with our Best of 2017 episode, so listen up for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul. Take care.